This
Tremendous
conference
honour
will
to be.
now be recorded.
Sorry, something mic for them. Tremendous honour to be invited to speak at to speak to a group as prestigious as this. So yeah, and hopefully you'll find my presentation interesting. So what I've sort of intend to go through is a bit of an insight in terms of leadership within maintenance, sort of what that means, and it's very much a big part of my role, and hopefully you'll find that that perspective interesting. So firstly, just a bit about me. So I've worked in the rail industry for 21 years. So I joined as a signalling telecoms apprentice back in 1999 during the infrastructure maintenance company days, and then transitioned to network rail in around 2006. So I spent around 10 years of my career in frontline and frontline management roles, specifically in the signalling maintenance function, and then the last 11 I've spent entirely within a variety of management roles within Network Rail, and predominantly within the Wessex route, which serves the Waterloo to Weymouth to Exeter to Portsmouth route. So my first real exposure to the world of track, having spent a number of years within the signalling discipline, was when I was in a planning role at Clapham Junction, and from that point, I must admit I've always been intrigued with track. Being sort of non-engineer myself, the track asset looks quite simplistic from a distance. However, the level of kind of effort and energy that's invested into it, and then the sheer cost makes it very exciting and very appealing, and dare I say, it's sort of almost far more exciting in some ways than the signalling asset. So our current role at the moment, as Andy touched on, is I'm the infrastructure maintenance delivery manager for what's known as the Wessex Outer. So my role is to lead the maintenance function for the outer part of Wessex. So Wessex is split into two component parts. So currently at the present time, I look after the signalling, track and EMP and lineside assets from Basingstoke to Exeter, and Basingstoke to Weymouth, Basingstoke to Portsmouth, and the line between Basingstoke and our boundary of our western colleagues at Reading. So the team's just over 500 people within my function, and around 360-ish people out of that 500 are frontline maintenance employees who work in the kind of disciplines of track, signalling, EMP, and line side. So as I sort of briefly touched on, my role is predominantly around leadership. I'm definitely not an engineer. It's all around how I lead and direct people, and hopefully today will act as a bit of an insight in terms of what I do and how I do it, and some of the things I've sort of learned and experienced along the way. So a bit of a fun fact about me is I do have a fear of public speaking, although we do seem to have that broadly mitigated by the fact that I can't actually see anyone when we're on video. And one sort of important note before I get sort of stuck in is obviously I am an employee of Network Rail, but I am sort of on my own time as it were at present. So the content of this presentation is purely based on my experiences and my opinion, and not representative of those of Network Rail. So yeah, so one of my big areas of focus has been around the environment that I need to create a kind of as a leader, and it's created by me through action or inaction. And really, this is forged by some of my sort of early experiences within leadership roles within maintenance. It's critical that that I provide an environment where people can succeed in what they do at every level within my team, all the way from my team of engineers all the way down to our guys and girls inspect the track on a day-to-day basis. The maintenance function is an incredibly challenging environment, particularly with the type of route that we have, in terms of it being heavily trafficked with freight and passenger services into Waterloo. Clearly things have changed quite a bit with COVID. However, the relentless focus that's placed on maintenance really hasn't changed. What the activities that we do when things go wrong, the feedback is always visible and always immediate, be it from a speed restriction being imposed for track defect, a rough ride, or a signalling failure. But the oddity about maintenance is when we succeed, it's very much the opposite. So the infrastructure operates as it should, and it's very easy to just quickly move on. And in my sort of first experiences, with our exposure to track earlier in my career, the thing that's always intrigued me, and it's always continues to intrigue me, is with our track management system. There's the dependency on people and people's judgment and engineering expertise to make judgments for the system to correct, to sort of system to operate end to end. You need to forgive my rather basic illustration of the track maintenance section for those that are or have been track maintenance engineers in the bottom right. But often in track and also within other functions of maintenance, often find that the people and leadership element is often overlooked, because there is a big focus on the technical elements of the function. But often when the difference between things going well and things going wrong is based on that judgment or decision, and then sometimes as a consequence of the environment, or drivers of where that decision is being made by a particular person in a particular place. So, and that's what I sort of really want to focus on through this presentation, is around how that's critical in terms of securing the right end result, which is all around having people in the place where they can do the best work, which will always have the outcome of running a safe and reliable railway. So at every level within the team, everyone has fundamental needs. So we need to provide meet those needs in order for people to succeed. So from the track inspection team leader to having the right welfare facilities, the tools and equipment, the competence, and the care and the attention from their line manager, etc. However, when you get further away from the front line, the needs become far less tangible, and also it's also far more complex. So for our managers and engineers, things around resource, budget, having the support and the tools to do their job, and also critically the leadership and direction, really sort of steal how successful those decisions are at times. And with our engineering group, the strategy, the risk management, and the empowerment to make those choices, to make those judgments, are very different to the needs, as I said, of someone who's on the front line. One of the things that's critical is around with that decision making, is around the unintended influence that can sometimes be on decisions. And I'd experienced fairly on in my time in role as a leader of a function, that made me very much reflect on the environment that had been created on the team, and also the impact that ultimately had on decisions and judgments made at that time. So at the time, I was managing a hugely experienced team, full of very, very competent, very capable people, and then we had a bit of an issue. So we suffered a I think it was two. It was a chain. It was basically a chain of track buckles that had been caused by the fact that we'd opted to do an intervention to disturb the track, to manage a risk, which actually wasn't the greater risk. And whilst there was all sorts of contributing factors that came out through the ensuing investigation, the thing that I really reflected on in that situation was, in terms of how I'd led the team at that time, had anything, was there things that I had done that kind of created this scene where the need to remove what was a minor fault to prevent a reliability issue, we'd in fact ended up creating a effective safety issue. Fortunately, in this case, the buckles were only minor misalignments, very low speed railway, unfortunately identified before before anything bad had happened. And actually, when I reflect on that time, we were approaching a period where there was a lot of focus on delivering a certain result, whilst a major piece of work that was taking place on the infrastructure, incredibly critical that the infrastructure around it, continues to run reliably and safely. And actually, through some of the things that I'd created in terms of what I was giving time to, what conversations with the team are around, it was all very weighted towards the importance of the blockade rather than the importance of us doing the basics. And in Sue, it almost contributed in some ways to an environment where actually, the delivery of said project had almost outweighed in my team's mind the priorities of us making sure that everything we do it in the right best possible way. And that was a huge piece of learning for me, really, and I've opted to do things very differently since then, sort of learning from that experience around how I, within the team, is keep that balance around making sure we give enough airtime for the basics, but also we talk about how we talk about the other stuff, but to make sure all the time that people are in a place where, if they need to syndicate a decision, they can, and everyone's comfortable doing so. So one of the other elements of maintenance is clearly part of our role is to react to the infrastructure and react to its condition, and also things that occur both internally and externally, and that's in our DNA. That's part of what we're here to do and what's expected of us in maintenance and network rail. And that reaction to things in terms of focusing on the short term gain, it can have a variety of reasons, from something breaks, something needs fixing, standards change, something external happens. COVID's a kind of a great example of that, where all of a sudden the envelope of how we operate needs to shift and becomes the immediate focus. And I'm very fortunate. I've always worked with very competent and capable people who are able to think of solutions and engineer our way out of some of these situations. But where it can become incredibly difficult is when that becomes the norm. So every team or every person or every role has a certain capacity. And effectively, within maintenance, we have some activities which are long-term activities and some activities which are short-term, and it's really critical that those two, whilst the size of the blue circle may get bigger against the grey at times, there always needs to be that kind of balance. Otherwise, that has all sorts of consequences, and it can arise for a variety of means. Sometimes demand can outstrip our ability to deliver. If we have a huge surge of work or a huge shortage of people, that affects that envelope of capacity. But also, if within leadership roles, if we're being inconsistent around priorities, which results in workload shifts where we're constantly shifting from priority to priority in an uncontrolled way, that can very much drive that approach within our teams. And when that becomes the culture and that becomes the norm, it's, as I said, it's not a good place to be, because not only does focusing on the short term come at great cost and with greater risk when we do things at short notice. Often, the measures and the checks we can have in place are less by the very nature of the time there is before you deliver the work. We lose sight of that horizon and what's almost a month away, 2 months away, 3 months away, and all that does is become a short term reaction. When it turns up on our doorstep. And we lose the opportunity to actually identify the root cause of some of the stuff that's driving that demand, because we don't have time to fix it, because the minute we fix that emergency, we're on to the next one. And then the delivery of work becomes less effective. So when people are pushed on the limit of what they need to do time wise. You know, often we see errors. You know, often we see incidents and potential unsafe working and people getting hurt, and that's absolutely not what we want. And also increased cost. So when we do things short notice, they generally cost a lot more than if we do it in a pre-planned, controlled way. And again, this creates another problem further down the line, where effectively, if we're just looking at the short term, we're going to get to a point where, you know, the spend exceeds what we've got, and then we have to then make a series. You know, we often find ourselves having to make a series of often short-sighted decisions around how we control costs to manage that risk. Those sort of environments aren't great places to work for our people, nor are they attractive to people, you know, from within Network Rail or externally. And often when it's become the short-term cultural, you know, reactive kind of spiral I've heard it referred to before, we really struggle to recruit and attract people into that team, but also struggle to retain people because it's not a place people want to work. And often the first. Hello, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Andy.
Oh, sorry, I lost it out of message about connection. I'll just turn the video off. Yeah, so often we'll see when we get into the short term activity as a culture, one of the first things that almost gets dispensed with, or activity stops or focus stops, is focus on people. And often this leads to a number of increased employee relations challenges, where we're not really focusing or prioritising the kind of care of our people. And again, that just adds to the just makes us more ineffective, as well. You know, generally you'll see, you know, things like short-term sickness, long-term sickness increase as the engagement wanes, as we take that focus off our people. The people within that group as well were often exposed, you know, to sort of high levels of stress and emotion, and, you know, in some extreme cases, you know, we see conflict between teams and functions, because typically drives people towards a silo approach, focusing on their own work, and not reaching out to others. And often it's those others that can actually help rectify some of the issues in the long term, before they become the very much short term problem. So one of the pieces of work specifically within the track maintenance space that I've been involved in some sort of considerable work and changes over the years is around span of control and how we view that. So within Network Rail, we have a very structured and regimented organisation with a series of layers, which breaks down into engineering functions, and then effectively sections within that function, and elements of that organisation built back in the early 2000s, and over time, you know, through incremental change, and I think that could probably be a presentation of its own. Over the years, you know, the amount of resource we have has increased, standards have changed as more kind of knowledge of the asset's been gained, and also how the asset is operated in terms of, you know, the volume of traffic, the type of traffic, has certainly given me some sort of specific challenges over the years, and generally those specific challenges exist in sections where almost you're already operating at the busy end of the scale. So typically where we have a combination of high tonnage of traffic, in terms of gross annual tonnage across a year, and also coupled up with challenging access. So operating, you know, areas around Waterloo and Clapham, where there's a huge focus on getting trains in and out of Waterloo, and first trains and last trains, and getting people home late at night. More so down towards Southampton and Eastleigh, where we operate quite a challenging and intensive freight service. So, and also areas where we can clearly see that actually our maintenance activity is more reaction into more reactive intervention, rather than proactive. And where we have engineering teams that also look after other functions but don't have their own, engineering leadership. So a couple of examples of things we've done within the Wessex route is we did an exercise a number of years ago looking at the geographic span of control of some of our busiest track sections. So what we call the Clapham track section exists in the London area, looks after basically all of the platforms out of Waterloo, so all 19 now 24 platforms, all the way down to Barnes and down towards Earlsfield on the main line. So that all came under one manager, one group of people. And we opted for a fairly lengthy change program because changing parts of the business does come with its own levels of risk, and clearly a long-term activity before you even get into all the people management aspects of then how you divide people into smaller groups. So we successfully split effectively the Clapham section manager span of control into two smaller sections. One looking after Wardleys of Vauxhall, and then the one Vauxhall to Barnes and Earlsfield. So quite a nice, neat split. And the purpose of that was really to provide, because of the intensity of the asset, to really provide, whilst you can give the front, we can provide more and more resource to the front line teams. What that tends to do is you hit the limitation of what people can direct, plan, deliver, and supervise. So we created effectively two standalone sections out of the one, and likewise we've just followed a similar exercise in 2019 for into this year, where we divided the Eastleigh track section into two smaller sort of subsections, one for Eastleigh and one to Southampton. And we've really seen, from both of these, we've really seen a lot of positive benefits in terms of, by reducing the line manager span of control, by reducing, his area and the number of people that he or she has, enables them to begin to break out of being very, very reactive and move more towards, being more proactive, and give those time to their people, to lead their people and supervise their people, which ultimately makes it more effective. And then Eastleigh, we've seen similar results now, where we have effectively the same amount of resource, from a frontline delivery perspective, but effectively delivers twice as much work at present. It was the same volume of resource we had when it was just Eastleigh. It's now Eastleigh and Southampton with a separate management team and supervision for both. We see them in parallel, pretty much 5 nights a week, delivering work, which is fantastic. But again, some of this comes out of when you've got people and engineers in a place where they're not reacting to something every day. They're able to think a bit further out. We're able to develop these concepts and then support people to actually deliver those. And I think both of those are fantastic examples of where the engineer has helped us ultimately design the right organisation to fit the needs, rather than it being being an idea at my level when I have limited visibility and certainly limited expertise within track and the function of what the solution would be. So the other thing is around, as I sort of touched on a minute ago, within track we do have a series of support functions. So we have our rail testing and lubrication teams, which look after the rail lubrication, but also the ultrasonic inspections, as well as welding and grinding, and our off-track drainage and line side, looking after line side fencing and boundary inspections, etc. So traditionally that team would sit under a track engineer that would also have a track section manager or a series of track section managers. And given that how those functions have grown, particularly with the criticality and the sort of expansion of rail management as an entity with ultrasonic inspection and lubrication, those teams have grown and grown and grown into something very much of their own right, deserving of and needing an engineer to lead that team from a functional and discipline perspective. and we've introduced a series of those across the Wessex route, almost in response to that growth over the years. And we've also looking at our track maintenance engineers and the size of their respective span of control. We've recently, created a track maintenance engineer that looks after specifically what we call the Bournemouth track area, which runs all the way from Redbridge, just south of Southampton, all the way down to Weymouth. Because the previous setup we had Bournemouth paired with what is eastern Southampton, which was incredibly challenging area, going through a lot of change, and we needed to divert some engineering expertise and some engineering focus into the Bournemouth area. But as I said, these changes in their own right are only structural changes. They don't fix. They don't fix all of our problems. They are purely structural. The key thing is around leadership and behaviours, and then how as a leader I create that environment. I'm accountable for creating that environment for people to succeed. And on that note of succeeding, we have a big, we do have a big challenge with maintenance, and rightly so. We have a huge, teams have a huge responsibility to keep the railway safe, and it can often be very difficult. And often some of the most critical roles in terms of critical locations can be the hardest to retain people and attract into, and to really have sustainability of the system that we have. It's really vital that for roles, particularly in maintenance, that they're platforms for people to do well and succeed, but not only to succeed, but to develop their own skills and engineering competence. And we support people's career progression through those roles. So it's creating these platforms. That there are a number of areas that are in focus, but really the most vital ingredient really is the leadership and the onus on roles such as my own to create that environment for people. And we have had some great levels of success recently with bringing people through into the team, both from externally from maintenance into engineering roles, but also from within. But we have to make it sustainable, not only for the individual, but also for the business. There's no value in having roles that are in incredibly challenging areas that aren't a good experience for that person to do and operate. Whilst they're always going to be challenging, it should be sustainable for the individual, because if it's not sustainable for the individual, it's not going to be sustainable for the business. And really focusing on creating a culture, an environment that is kind of conducive to people to develop and learn. And then we have safety nets in place, for people as we're developing them, because we don't want, people aren't going to want to go into positions whereby the margin for error is so narrow that they're kind of always in fear or risk of if ultimately they make the wrong decision, or we don't get necessarily the right outcome. And that takes a lot of that takes a lot of focus, and the onus really is on me and my peers to hold that environment and really encourage people. So and also really important, as I said, not an engineer myself, but I've really seen the benefits from people who I've worked for and who have worked for me, who have that whilst working within the business have really continued to push their professional and academic development, and increasing their overall level of engineering competence, and that is really important. But at the same time, we need to create an environment where people feel comfortable and people's workloads are manageable, so they can do that. So that brings me to the end. I hope that was an interesting insight into what I do and the world of leadership and maintenance. As Andy said, I'm happy to take any questions, etc. you may have, and just once again, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you all today.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was an absolutely barnstorming little talk there, and hopefully that has prompted a lot of questions in the minds of our attendees today. I'm going to be a cheeky chairman, and whilst people are busy thinking about what they would like to ask or plucking up the courage to do so, I'll just ask you one thing, if I may. So the insights that it was a very insightful talk, I felt. How did you get those insights about the impact of leadership and culture on the performance and effectiveness of people? Were you measuring things, or were you just observing?
So I think very much through observation and almost my my experience in my time in maintenance at almost very levels is kind of I've almost, I guess, where I've almost lived in it for a period of time. I think I've seen things happen and done things myself and reflected on that. And I think it's always important to reflect on whether or not something's not necessarily the end result, but in terms of how you achieved it and whether or not you did that the right way. But we have recently started to move towards a bit more of a scientific approach to understanding whether or not we're in the people space, particularly by getting employees feedback, which can often be challenging. With surveys and network rail aren't two things that go very hand in hand. But we've recently deployed a form of what they call a neutral assessment, which is effectively a survey, but with no preset questions, where it enables people to talk to someone who's truly independent, and they document and produce a report. And we've recently done that for one of our teams to understand if some of the things we are doing are actually having the sort of intended benefits of creating an environment. And actually, you know, through that, we've realised that actually, whilst often we have really good intentions, how we do things can sometimes be quite disruptive. And actually, you know, it's sort of, yeah, again made me think and reflect about, you know, if we have these tools before we make these big decisions, we can always make sure that we're doing the right thing and almost get that feedback from our teams first of what they require. You know, Network Rail has traditionally at times been a very top-down organisation. I think there's a real importance to almost turn it on its head with a lot of this stuff to get the ideas from the front line. Yeah, that answers your question, Andy.
Coming from contributors, which I'm going to ask on their behalf. So the first one is from Peter Halliwell. How easy or difficult did you find it to reconfigure systems like ellipse, RDMS, track geometry, patrolling diagrams, and so on around the changed arrangements for maintenance engineers and section managers?
So I think incredibly challenging. So to give you just a rough picture of how long that's taken. So we went live with effectively some of the critical systems split in around, that was January, and the project to complete all the system changes has just closed, and that's also come at quite a great financial cost, because it does appear that we don't, with a lot of these systems, we don't actually sufficiently own them to make the changes ourselves. Ellipse is fairly straightforward. RDMS and others slightly more complex, and GeoRhythm and various other bits and pieces. But yeah, it has been incredibly challenging. Unfortunately, with where we were doing the divide within a single TME, from a risk management perspective, we were able to keep a close eye on things to make sure it wasn't missed. But if it had been changing engineers' boundaries, for examples, where you don't have that hierarchy line of sight, I think it would have taken us probably considerably longer than it has done to go live.
Great, thanks very much, Peter. If you've got any follow-up questions, please type them in. The next question comes from Paul Ebbett, and he asks, what level of encouragement have you had from Network Rail's senior management to encourage professional registration?
So I think it's a really good question. I probably need to not speak too soon, because I have registered for an apprenticeship which they say the apprentice, when you mean apprenticeships, we use that to qualify all levels of entry into the business, but also within the business as various levels. So I have been encouraged and supported an application to do an honours degree through an apprenticeship scheme over, I think, it's 4 years, and in a specific railway engineering discipline. And actually, believe it or not, the discipline that I've actually chosen is track, because I thought that would be more interesting and intriguing than signalling, which has very much moved on since when I joined the business. It was all very, very mechanical and stuff, and now it's far more electronic and land networks and whatnot, and not really my cup of tea. So yeah, but that support to develop yourself is there. I think some of the more, there's more and more of that stuff available now. But as I said, and traditionally the uptake in maintenance or infrastructure maintenance has been low because of the sort of, the kind of demand, and there is a real need for myself and my peers, in the roles that we have, is to support people and give people the space so they can develop themselves, because it is really important, and ultimately helps people progress their careers and helps the business progress.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question comes from Paul Meads, and he asks, Andy, as a successful infrastructure manager, how much have you found that you need to learn about the management of individual assets compared to relying on the expertise of other members in the team?
So I think so often in the two roles that I've had as in terms of a delivery manager, track has always been one of almost the largest risks. It is by nature the largest function within maintenance anyway. So my learning curve with like in track, whilst there's no requirement for me to have a particular discipline specific sort of foundational knowledge, I've been very fortunate that there's been a lot of people around that are willing to kind of sort of educate me along the way, and I've spent a lot of time learning from people within the route, within the track space, to kind of build up that kind of knowledge. As I said, there's a level of sort of that's curiosity driven, but really in terms of risk, particularly on where I am at present, it's historically been an incredibly challenging place from a track perspective. So I've sort of taken it upon it myself really, and I've encouraged I'd encourage others to do the same in terms of widening that knowledge of of the asset in detail, because it's very difficult. It's very difficult. I would find it very difficult if I didn't understand standard elements and how things work. I would find leading very difficult, because you don't know the consequences of some of the stuff that you might be doing, either inadvertently, for want of a better word. But as I said, I've been very fortunate by having people within the route that've been able to spend the time with me to kind of to sort of help educate me in the world of track before I found out the hard way.
Great stuff. Thank you. Jolyon Bates asks of you, are you trying to implement new ideas to be more productive, and new ideas to achieve longer lasting repairs?
So I think it's a very good question, and I think that the challenge almost is now going forward, particularly with sort of, I believe, with the industrial backdrop that we have as a transport industry now, is particularly as funding will invariably been impacted, or continue to be impacted by what's occurred with COVID and the amount of people using the infrastructure. I think there is a big challenge there around actually, for the money we invest in the activities we do, how do we make sure we get absolute maximum benefit from that intervention? And I think particularly within track jointry repairs, we see that we're whilst we've got a more resource than we've ever had behind track geometry repairs and turning around faults within a time scale, what we are seeing is we haven't got any more effective for our repairs. And I think, yeah, it needs to be, I think, more of an area of focus, and especially particularly with what's on the horizon potentially with, you know, with the way the industry's direction's going with our funding, etc. So
great stuff. And I think perhaps this next question from Steve Welcome follows on from that. What's top of your list that you would like to change or do differently that you feel you're not able to do at this time?
Oh, that's a yeah. So I think the yeah, I think so. So I think so. I don't mean this in a negative way, but we are a very sort of so yeah. So we are. So there's various things that we would, you know, that we would like to do if we had the opportunity. We are very unionised industry, and you know, I do believe that, you know, trade unions are a good thing, but the challenge is that almost does slow down. That does slow down. There's a slow down element of our evolution, but it's not I don't believe it's not a TU issue. It comes down to, we make agreements, you know, with the TUs around how we're going to do things. But when we kind of go into that agreement, we don't realise knock-on consequences for how slow we're going to make the process. So particularly around the introduction of new technology, particularly in the world we're at the moment, where we're looking at safer ways for our frontline teams to work. That does invariably hold us back. But we've gone into agreement knowingly. It's not a, you know, it may seem I'm being negative, but I don't intend it to be that way. But it's almost, you know, there's this great technology out there which, you know, other industries are able to easier to deploy. And sometimes we're not in that space, which can be quite, you know, can be quite frustrating. But I think ultimately everyone's got the right things at heart, but we just need to work on that. I think we need to work on that more to be more sort of, you know, be more responsive to the kind of needs of the asset and the expectations that are placed on us.
Brilliant answer, thank you, Andy. The next question comes from Stuart C. Sorry, I don't know Stuart's surname. If you're focusing on the organisation of the maintenance, do you have any insights on the organisation at your own level and above? Oh, careful.
So we've recently gone. So for those that are familiar with NetRail know that NetRail over its existence or its creation, we've gone through a number of sort of, I would call, like rebrandings where we as a company we have a new vision. So for example, we've been first class. We've tried to be world leaders in railway engineering. Various bits and various other alliterations that I can't fully recall. But recently we've got almost a new vision, which is around putting passengers first. And it does intrigue me, because I think this is the first time that I can recall where actually we've put a human being at the centre of what we do. And I think, you know, the boss, we're putting passengers first. You know, I think the reality and sort of the reality of that situation is that actually that's going to benefit maintenance significantly, because within the business, you know, we deliver something that's a very obvious product, and I think that will help us. And also the fact that we're focused on a human being for a change, rather than a kind of an aspiration to focus on someone and providing a service to someone and putting them in the centre of everything we do. It's a very interesting concept of how you take us from being very engineering into being very customer focused, but obviously in a safe and reliable way. So yeah,
Andy, that's fantastic. Let's see if you can keep this stuff going. Bob Hazel, I think I know him, a very experienced track engineer, says, Andy, how does managing the outer area of Wessex compare with managing the inner area of Wessex as far as the role of IMDM is concerned?
So that's a brilliant question. So I think, you know, I think the interesting reflection I have is how despite the fact, you know, we're all within the same business, we're all within the same team, how different things are, you know, in terms of and by the nature of having different people, the culture and the tone and the direction can be different. And I've spent the best part of 7 or 8 years in Inner, so knew it very well, with all the ups and downs. But I think the two are very similar, although the challenges are different. Waterloo's just an absolute handful to keep in check all the time. On outer, it's the mainline corridor on the freight is very difficult in terms of the stakeholder management, around aspirations of freight and what expectations they have on the asset and what it delivers, as well as trying to balance in our passenger kind of colleagues as well. So yeah, I think that's probably the main difference. And in terms of your second point, Bob, I think that the challenge on outer is almost the biggest challenge is around sharing what we do. On Inner, things were my job was made very easy by the very nature that everything's very visible, whereas in outer it's not, it doesn't steal as much limelight. And also, within maintenance, there's almost there's a reluctance to share what we do, because when we deliver something on time, we deliver it well. That's sort of the expected sort of norm. So getting people to share what we do and help raise that profile of how critical maintenance is and how critical it is that we get access to the track at the right time, and we get the tools and equipment we need, and we need investment, and we need refurbishment, and helping building that profile, I think, is probably my biggest challenge, I think.
Jolly good, thanks. I have a follow-up question from Peter Halliwell for you. How have the coronavirus risk measures affected things like supervision, mentoring, surveillance, level 1 assurance? And does this raise any concerns for knowledge of the state of the railway, how effective inspections are, quality of delivered work, and so on?
Yeah, so clearly when we first entered COVID, it was almost very extremely uncharted territory, and particularly on the outer, we have various teams which have a single dependency on a single person, and also we saw a lot of people go into the kind of self-isolation. A lot of key employees, inspectors, etc., go in. And that did create a very challenging situation, in that all of a sudden, in the space of a couple of weeks, we've no longer got the resource or the ability to do what we were previously able to do. Fortunately, that I think we're very fortunate on Wessex with the people who are in our asset management team and also our engineering teams, and we're able to respond very quickly to making sure that actually where we know there's something we can't do, how do we cover that off and manage that risk through other means. The reduction in the train service obviously helps with that. But from a deployment of people standpoint of view, we took an effective sort of critical and essential type approach to make sure that actually with the diminished resource and control and our ability to just the cease of our ability to do things face to face, I think was probably the biggest challenge. In terms of in person with paperwork, etc. Teams have been very creative around how they do that, and we had almost in place a sort of mini weekly assurance regime to make sure that we were doing the things we need to do. But we reduced our activity quite significantly, so it was easier to do. And then with the months that preceded that, new standards were released and more things were formalised. And now we've sort of over the last 3 or 4 months, we've ramped back up to normal. Obviously, we're entering a really interesting period now, and the exposure is almost greater because we're still continuing to run an 85%, I think it is, service on Wessex at present. So obviously, if we encounter resource issue now, we haven't got that almost redundancy with being able to take a view of how the railway's been operated now from a track category perspective, with less trains, because we're almost at the the limit.
Thanks, Andy. I think we could just about squeeze the last 2 questions in the remaining 4 minutes. having explained very clearly why you like putting passengers first as a an expression of putting people at the centre of our activity, John Dolan asks, could putting passengers first have an adverse effect on freight?
Yeah, so obviously views my own and not those of Network Rail, but so I think the fact that we've now bolted down freight on the end probably says that was a bit of an oversight. I think for me, I've never had real interfaces with freight, but when I was previously on the inner, obviously coming to the outer, it is extremely challenging to give them almost what they kind of expected. Some of the situations we've had where we've closed sidings, etc. The financial ramifications to them and their customers, also to us, have been very significant and in six digits. In terms of penalties and fines and loss of revenue. So, and I think the fact that the freights and good lines see a sort of lower level of investment, I think almost in some regards I think they do feel at times that they are almost they play an element of second fiddle to passenger services. And I think if enough I look at how we react and respond to things at times, that does bear through. And at the moment, particularly with some of the challenge I have around asset condition in sidings and goods lines, we're really trying to sell to them the stuff that we're doing, to say that, look, we are taking this really seriously, because we need their help, particularly on outer. I need their help more than I need the help of South Western Railway to get access, because actually most of my really difficult places to access are because of freight, and particularly at the moment where we're running the longer freight services. We've got Southampton Freight Lengthening, which will enable them to run more services, and even longer services. It's really important, that me and my team almost shift that balance a bit to make sure that we're putting the customer first in the right balance.
Good stuff. And just one last thing then from Paul Ebbett again, and when he asked his question about encouragement from senior management for people to do professional registration, I misrepresented that question slightly. It wasn't just encouragement to you, it was encouragement to your team. Do you think they're giving encouragement for you to get your team professionally registered as well?
Yeah, so it's something I've encouraged. I guess it's always individual choice whether or not someone wants to do that. I think the most important thing is that person to feel like to make sure they've got the choice, and in terms of making sure that if someone does want to pursue that, they can have that open conversation with their line manager or myself. And we've got some, there's been some great examples over the past year or so of people who have gone into that route, and I would always support that. But I believe the onus is on me to provide that encouragement so people can make that free choice.
Excellent. And just by way of an advert, Paul says he would of course recommend to Andy and to everybody the PWI Track Engineering Diploma course Module 1 as a good introduction to track engineering.
I'll take a note of that.
Okay, that is by a miracle of timing, it is exactly 6 o'clock. So Andy Malcolm, you are running the Right Time Railway and the Right Time presentation. I'd like to thank you very, very much on behalf of Wessex and Sussex and Croydon branches of the PWI for the talk you've just given, and on behalf, of course, of all the people who've listened to and enjoyed your talk and asked all those questions. What a fabulously candid and open speaker you are, Andy. You from the starting point of saying that you've got a nervousness of public speaking, the way that you dealt thoroughly and openly with that hugely diverse range of questions was marvelously impressive. You won your audience over right at the start by saying that track was a more exciting asset than signalling. So of course we were hanging on to your every word from then on. But the huge message that I took from your talk, which is so inspiring, is that leadership is about creating a platform for people to succeed, and you've eloquently and concisely described how you set about that task. So thank you very much again, Andy, for your talk tonight. Thank you, everybody who's attended and listened, and we hope to meet again and see you again at future PWI meetings. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.